All right. Steve Norman,
Clint
how you
Dupin.
doing, brother?
I'm well. Thanks so much for having me today, man.
Oh man, I'm so honored to have you here on my new show called In Clint's Office. And I mean, you're welcome. It's a privilege for you. I understand that. So right behind here, I have one of my degrees right there. It's right there. So it's just I call it the wall of honor. But anyway, Steve, it's so
Listen, you
man,
put your diploma like 6 inches off the ground. You know that it's customary to put it at like eye level, right, Clint?
well, there's some hidden meaning there, Steve. Hey, talk to me, man. How are you doing? I miss you.
The feeling's mutual. We're doing well, man.
Where are you at right now?
I'm in West Michigan, in sunny Holland, Michigan, and it's good times, man.
Just for people that are maybe watching now or watching later, Steve and I worked together for about 10 years at Kensington Church in Metro Detroit. And we had many good times together, many good laughs. But one of the most memorable things was the honor of starting Hope Water Project with this guy. And I thought he was insane when he started running marathons. Turns out he was insane. And it's one of the greatest things. Like I'll look back and say, hey, that's one of the greatest things that I was a part of in my lifetime. And we got to do that together. So I was really excited about that. Hey, so I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in the West Bank, Israel, Jerusalem, Palestine area.
Sure.
Because you've got some knowledge, and the reason I really want to talk about it is because you see people posting, you hear things on the news, even my kids have questions, and I just think, a lot of times we just listen to different sources and we don't really know what's really happening, where the conflict started, what's going on both sides. And this one's really maybe close to the heart is a little strong, but I just think I just remember my last trip there, and up until that trip, it was Holy Land tours and different things like that. Really, just not even aware of conflict that was going on, just more visiting sites. And then my eyes were open when I took a trip, and we lived in Palestine for a while. And we did, we visited some universities. We worked with some organizations that were bringing Israeli and Palestinian youth together, working on peace, but hearing stories like personally, and it began to change me and begin to frustrate me. And I didn't know what to do with it. And so I think people are kind of there, not even just with this conflict, Steve, but with a lot, right? It's like, what do I do with all of this? But I kind of want to focus on this in particular right now, the conflict that's happening in Israel and Palestine. And so can you give us a little history? Like, I know that's a big question. Can you give us a little history of like where this started and why are we here?
Sure. So it depends on how far back you want to go, but Jesus prophesied that a day would come when Jerusalem would be destroyed, and different people are trying to debate over whether that already happened or whether that's still to happen. But the long story short is that the Romans defeated and crushed a Jewish uprising in 70 AD, or 70 CE, depending on how you want to call it, and completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. And many Jews were forced to flee. There was another uprising about 70 years later that was also mercilessly destroyed by the Romans. And so the Jews went from being a dominant presence in the region to over time having a diminished presence in the region. And over the next 1,000 years up until the 20th century, Jews spread all out over the world. And right around the time, kind of right around the turn of the 20th century, Jews were definitely facing increased persecution in Russia and in Eastern Europe and even in Western Europe. And a lot of them were trying to say, hey, it might not be tenable for us to be people on the fringes anymore. Our human rights are being violated. We're not being given economic opportunities. And obviously all of that came to a head at World War II with the absolutely abhorrent murder and massacre of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. And so in the wake of World War II, a lot of people said, like, hey, the Jews should be able to have a place that is their own, a place that they could call home. And so many Jews who are survivors of the Holocaust relocate. And again, this is broad strokes. I'm speaking in generalities, so we can do this quickly. Relocated to what we now know as Israel. At that time, there were a lot of Arabs who were living in that area. We call them Palestinians. And as Jewish people started to move in, it certainly over time upset the population differential. The demographics changed from the Jews being a minority to being a sizable minority over time. And so, long story short, in 1948, when the British government said that they were going to move out of Israel-Palestine as kind of caretakers, kind of like the United States said, hey, we can't manage things in Afghanistan and Iraq anymore, we're moving out. Well, when that power vacuum happened, the people who would eventually be known as the Israelis fought for their independence. So 1948, Israel became a state. When that happened, about 700,000 Palestinians fled to neighboring countries of Lebanon and Jordan and Syria. And then, so Israel became a state. And then the question was, how much of the land that they had initially had access to in Bible times would they be able to reclaim? And so the one area that they hadn't been able to get was Jerusalem. And so in the War of 1967, Israel was finally able to take over Jerusalem as well. Up until that point had been kind of occupied by the Jordanians. So Jerusalem is a key part of Israel's history. The problem was that there are still significant pockets of Palestinian Arabs who lived in that area. So some of them who were forced to be refugees in 48 were forced to be refugees again in 67. And so part of the reason that we see the conflict today is both Israel and the Palestinians want to claim Jerusalem as their capital. And so depending on who you talk to, the reason that this kind of like the spark that started this most recent conflict between Gaza and Israel was the fact that Palestinian Muslims were observing holy days of Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is where things get a little bit complicated. The Jews own and run all of Jerusalem, but the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are actually kind of run by the Jordanian government. So you have this like little, it's almost like the Vatican in the middle of Italy, it's its own place.
Right.
So the Jordanians have a chance to oversee the Dome of the Rock, which is the big gold dome that you see in all the skyline photos of Israel. And what's adjacent to that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So because Israeli security governs who can get into and out of that site, and because in the Muslim tradition, sometimes Friday prayers are part religious service and then part political rally, according to the Palestinians, the Israelis were acting with kind of a heavy hand with security. Ended up being a skirmish between the worshipers and Israeli security forces. And on top of that, some Palestinians who still lived in the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, there's a debate about whether or not they can be forced out of their homes to create space for things that Israeli Jews want to do in that area. So those two issues, the threat of evictions of Palestinian families from homes that they've lived in for generations, and the threat of religious freedom happening at the same time, really was causing a lot of angst and anxiety. So the government in Gaza, which is Hamas, which is designated by the United States as a terrorist organization, which has solely ruled what's been happening in the Gaza Strip for about the last 14 years. They view themselves as kind of the protectors of the Islamic faith in Palestine, and they also view themselves as these historic freedom fighters for the Palestinian cause. But they're landlocked. So imagine that San Diego has been cut off from the rest of the world. So they share a border to the south with Mexico. They've got the sea on the west, and then they share like a northern and an eastern border with the rest of California. It's very similar to what's happening in Gaza. To the south is their border with Egypt. To the west is the Mediterranean Sea, and then they have a border with Israel on the north and on the east. Israel has, and you've seen the security wall, Clint, or the barrier. Israel has built this massive security barrier around Gaza to the north and to the east. There's also been a blockade of Gaza economically and politically from both Israel and Egypt. And so Gaza is a city with high population density. There's about 2 million people living in an area that's only about 140 miles square. And they have limited access to regular water. They've got limited access to regular power. In this conflict, they've had limited access to medical care and help. But here's the challenge: if you're in an area that's being bombarded and you have nowhere to go, it's a nightmare. And again, there's complexities on both sides. But I think part of the reason people were viewing what was happening in Gaza as a humanitarian crisis is because if you want to do airstrikes, it's almost like shooting fish in a barrel. You got a lot of people who are trapped with nowhere to go. And even if you use the best military strategies and the smartest of all technologies, there are going to be civilian casualties no matter how you want to slice it. Now,
so let me ask you a question before you keep going. So that's amazing how you describe that. And that's one of the things, because now you have a crippled economy, correct? So you've cut Gaza off from the rest of Palestine.
Yep.
Most people would say, well, it's all the people in Palestine are Islamic, and then people that are in Israel are all Jewish, and blah, blah, blah. So can you kind of break that down a little bit? Because we have Hamas, all of those, like there's a lot of little different things that are happening there. Can you kind of talk through some of those?
Sure. So three kind of political parties on the Palestinian side that you need to be aware of is Hamas, which runs all of Gaza, and then Hezbollah is another organization that you'll hear about. They're a kind of pro-Palestinian political party that has a presence in southern Lebanon on Israel's northern border. Israel had a war there, I believe it was in 2014. So when Israel is fighting Palestinian militant groups, they're usually fighting them in the north, which is Hezbollah, or they're fighting them in the west, which is in the Gaza Strip. But then another group that you'll hear about is called the Palestinian Authority. And Yasser Arafat, who helped broker the Oslo peace accords in the early 90s, with Yitzhak Rabin, who was ultimately assassinated, largely because he helped broker those agreements. The Palestinian Authority is the Palestinian political entity that oversees everything that's happening in the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority used to have an involvement with Gaza until the Palestinian Authority got voted out. So the Palestinian Authority used to have a presence in both the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, and now they're relegated solely to the West Bank. And so part of the problem here is that some people want to believe that if Palestine becomes its own nation, you have to figure out how to connect two parts of where they live that aren't contiguous. They're not connected to one another. It would be like, okay, well, we have our country, but we've got this little pocket in San Diego, the Gaza Strip, and then we also have Vermont. Well, how do you
Right.
even connect those two to one another? So there was a political battle years ago over who was going to get a chance to run Gaza Strip. Hamas had a political and an armed conflict with the Palestinian Authority, and they voted them out. So you've got a bunch of different players. You've got people in the West Bank who want similar things to what people in Gaza want for Jerusalem and Palestine, but they have disagreements about how to get there, and different political leaders and parties that they hope will make that happen.
Man. I want to go back. I wrote this down when you're talking about this. A few people have asked me the question, like, why is the Dome of the Rock so significant to the Palestinians or the Nation of Islam? Like, why is that such a big deal?
Yeah, so it's called the third holiest site in all of Islam. So you've got Mecca, which is the holiest site. You've got Medina, which is the second holiest site. Both of those are in Saudi Arabia. And then you've got the third holiest site, which is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So Palestinians who live in the West Bank or who live in Gaza, they need permission from Israel to travel anywhere. So if Palestinians cannot get to Saudi Arabia, and politically it's probably not the smartest thing for security reasons for the Israelis to let people go to Saudi Arabia and then come back, the holiest place that they can get to is Jerusalem. So it would be like if you're a Christian and you're saying like, hey, there's only one church in town, I'm going to do everything that I can do to make sure that I have access to that church. But again, it doesn't solely affect Palestinians. It also affects because Jerusalem is considered to be outside of the West. It's in East Jerusalem, which is largely has a Palestinian presence, but it's also in territory that is controlled by Israel. Arabs and Muslims from Bethlehem or from Ramallah or from Nablus, they need permission from the Israeli government to go and worship in Jerusalem. But it's not just Muslims, it's Christians. You and I have friends who are Palestinian Christ followers in Bethlehem. They need permission from the Israeli government to go and worship at Christian sites in Jerusalem. So if they want to celebrate Christmas, or sorry, if they want to celebrate Easter in Jerusalem, they need permission to do that. So there's a lot of different, there are things that are needed, very complex issues that need to be juggled there, which is Israel would say, hey, security is a priority, as well it should be given their history. And I just want to go on the record for saying, like, absolutely, Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorist attacks. And for all the debate about the measures, about whether certain measures that they have taken have been appropriate, by and large, they've been effective in minimizing casualties since the second Intifada, which broke out around the year 2000. But there's a lot of different pieces that are in play.
So the latest conflict, what pushes Hamas, and this latest one is Hamas, correct? That's been at war. What pushes them to the point, because you referred to this a little bit earlier, when you push a group, when you push something too far, eventually something's going to happen. What was the latest one?
So I think that if I'm understanding the story correctly, it was two issues. It was the fact that their Jewish courts are deciding whether or not certain Palestinian families will have to be evicted from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, the suburb of Jerusalem. That, and then that was compounded by the fact that Muslims were celebrating Ramadan, and that there was a conflict at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So the Hamas says, hey, whenever there's a problem if you push us at the mosque, we will push back, and we'll make a statement, and we'll be noticed. And they don't have a ground army, they don't have an air force, they don't have a navy. All they have are these rockets, which, tragically have killed, I believe, around a dozen Israelis, and that's inexcusable, and it's heartbreaking. But it's almost like the only weapon that they have to get international attention and to get the Israelis to sit up and take notice are to launch these rockets. And I'd been told that a long time ago they were actually having pre-made rockets supplied to them by Iran and other players that are hostile towards Israel. But over time, the Gazans learned how to make rockets on their own. And so they've been building thousands of rockets over the last 2 years or 4 years since the last time we had one of these conflicts. And there's every reason to believe that unless this issue gets resolved again, Gazans will just shift right back into rocket making production. And this whole scenario could repeat itself in 4 months or 4 years.
Man, there's so much to what you're saying. So as a follower of Jesus, what is our response? Like, how do we, there's so many layers to that. Like, what are we watching? What are we listening to? What should we be doing or even thinking in this season when we see stuff like this happen?
Yeah, Clint, I think it's so important for us to for those of us who claim to be Christ followers, to make sure that everything that we say, do, and believe really is anchored in the teachings of Jesus. And I think that when Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," I think he meant it. And I think that any part of us that celebrates war or celebrates the loss of any human life at any level, for me, you can't reconcile that with the gospel that Jesus preached. And so I think that when there's loss, there should be mourning, there should be lament, there should be heartbreak. And then I think there should be prayer. And then I think we also, it's not our job to fix everything that's broken about the world, but we should say, like, all right, God, what part of the solution are you asking me to be a part of? And I think that for many, especially white evangelical Christians, a step towards learning and understanding and humility is, God, will you give me the grace to listen to other people's stories? And I think that you and I both, we had never met a Palestinian who was a follower of Jesus until we had a chance to get our feet on the ground in the region. And likewise, many people assume that every single person who claims Jewish heritage in Israel is a follower of what we would perceive to be the Old Testament ways of Judaism. And there are a handful of Jewish people by ethnicity and by nationality who are actually they're Christ followers. So for me, understanding the conflict really started with saying, hey, I need to listen to people who live there and say, will you tell me your story, and will you help me understand how it works? I remember when I was flying out of Tel Aviv, I was stopped by one of the security officials, and she was a young woman. Everybody in Israel does mandatory military service out of high school. And so there's this young woman, and she was joking with her friend, and they were looking at me and they were laughing, which happens almost everywhere I go. But they were speaking in Hebrew, so I was like, "But hey, what's so funny?" And they said, "Oh, well, your identity papers say that you're a pastor." And I was like, "Yeah." And they're just like, "Well, you just don't look like any of the rabbis that you know." So we started a conversation. I noticed that she had a pretty unmistakable like scar on her forearm. And I said, "Hey, what happened to your arm?" And she's like, "I survived a terrorist attack when I was a kid in school." And so like for her, it was real. Like she, but on the same, I don't know if it was the same trip or a different trip, but I met a pastor in Bethlehem who said that one time when there was a militant uprising in Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank, and the
Right.
Israeli military came in to shut it down, he goes, my 5-year-old daughter was pinned down under automatic gunfire from the Israeli army in our backyard, and she was hiding behind a tree, and I was trying to figure out how to get to her and bring her back to safety. And like Clint, for whatever troubles you and I have faced, we've never survived a bomb attack, and fortunately, by the grace of God, we've never had to pull Claire or Grace out of a gun battle that's erupted in our backyard.
Right.
And so the threat of violence is real. The conflict is real. The pain is real. And I believe that Jesus doesn't call you and I to fix it, but Jesus has already placed voices of wisdom and peace and hope and prophetic representations of the gospel on the ground in Israel. And I think sometimes our greatest gift can be to meet them, to hear them, to listen to their story and tell their stories. And I think that I had kind of bought into a false narrative that said that region will always be broken and all Palestinians are Muslims and all Muslims are terrorists. And I've learned that was not the case. I had the opportunity to speak at a men's retreat that was organized by a guy that you and I both know. And I was speaking to a group of men who were spiritually curious, but they were all Palestinian Muslim men. And I was leading them through conversations I was doing the devotions for 2 days that we were at this retreat. And I remember there's a part of me that was a little bit, just in my own ignorance, Clint, that was nervous to be able to say, like, I'm a follower of Christ. I'm white. I'm an American. Am I in danger in this environment? And at the end of this men's retreat, where we were having conversations with them about Jesus, I stood up to these men and through a translator, I said, "Hey, I just want to thank you so much for letting me be your guest this week." And they started yelling in Arabic like they were mad. And I was like, "Oh no, I finally done did it. Like I'm in trouble now." And and I asked my translator, I was like, what are they saying? He's like, "They're offended that you consider yourself their guest because they call you their brother."
Mm.
And I wasn't their brother because they'd all become followers of Jesus and gotten baptized on this retreat. I was their brother because I spent time and energy to be with them and break bread with them and listen to them and hear their stories. So I think a lot of times when we read the news, we get the most dramatic, most fear-laced, most depressing versions of the story. And we keep forgetting that like Jesus never left the Holy Land. He still walks the sand and the dirt and the stones there. And if God is an omnipresent God is in Gaza right now, like is in Gaza, and the Spirit is resting over Jerusalem, and God is at work in those places, and God wants to work in and through his people in those places. And Clint, I'll just want to share one more story with you quickly. Two of our friends from the region, one Jewish follower of Jesus and one Palestinian follower of Jesus, Akiva and Salim, came and spoke at Kensington and Detroit, and our friend Adam Smart took them on a tour of some of the neighborhoods near the heart of the city center. And I remember I wasn't on that trip with them, but when they came back, they said the division that you have between white people in Detroit and black people in Detroit is worse than what we have between Palestinians and Jews in Israel. And sometimes it's easy for me to sit a couple thousand miles away on the other side of the ocean and be like, wow, those guys are screwed up. They got stuff that they need to figure out. They come here and they're like, yeah, you guys have stuff that you need to figure out. And just because it is not go ahead.
No, I just say, and this is where I wanted to go, is like there seems to be connection, right? It's like
absolutely
who we're rooting for there or who we're rooting for here or blah, blah. They're just, as Christ followers, it's like how have we become so divided? How have we become so politically divided? How we racially divided? All of it. I was in a meeting yesterday, and there was this guy who was speaking, and he, not a pastor, but he was from Dallas, and he said that you can't tell me a place in the world that has larger churches, more more churches, more people who go to church, more people who claim to be Christ followers. And he says, to this day, Dallas is still one of the most racially divided cities. He's like, why doesn't that change? Why isn't that changing? And so this is what just continues to break my heart to see posts, that people who claim to follow Jesus, that is so divisive, that's so full of hate, almost cheering on one side. And it's just, it just, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram and I get really angry, Steve, right? It's like, I just don't understand it sometimes.
Yeah. And I think, Clint, one of the things I learned in just in my research and the journey that I've been over is part of the reason that we have those problems is because our view of the gospel is way too narrow and it's too small. And I know a lot of evangelicals are like, hey, we got to watch out for the social gospel. And what they mean is like, there's a version of the gospel that's really progressive and it doesn't preach Jesus and it doesn't preach salvation. It just preaches good works and kind of social progressiveness. So there are a lot of people who they use social gospel as like a dirty word. But when you read Jesus didn't preach any other kind of gospel than a gospel than one that had societal implications. So you and I learned in Hope, like part of the impetus between Hope Water is for us to say like, hey, if Clint and Steve find Jesus and we get to go to heaven when we die, that's not the end of the story. Like there's work that he wants us to do to proclaim and honor and advance his kingdom. And one of the ways that we do that is through compassion. We kind of help people get clean water. We help people get education. We help people get their wounds bound. And so like a one-dimensional gospel is I get to go to heaven when I die. I'm reconciled with Jesus. I'm forgiven of my sins. That is an important part of the story, but that's only a sliver of it. And then the broader part is like, once we together become followers of Jesus, it's our job to be like an agent of healing and kindness and care and compassion. But then there's a third dimension to the gospel as well, beyond salvation and beyond compassion, and that's societal transformation. And when Jesus preaches his inaugural sermon in Nazareth, he's quoting the prophet Isaiah. And it's very fascinating because he says, he goes, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to set captives free. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, well, did he mean spiritual captives or did he mean actual captives? Is he speaking metaphorically or is he speaking literally? And the answer is yes. So Jesus cares about people who are spiritually blind and he cares about people who are literally blind.
Yeah.
And he cares about systems that are oppressing people. Like that is in the words of Jesus as he's quoting the gospel of Isaiah. And just because that makes a lot of us who have been at the center of power dynamics in the United States for a long time, just because that makes us uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's wrong. Yeah. And so I think a lot of us, what we like to do is we like to take our worldview and then just kind of overlay it on the scriptures and then we're happy. But the truth is, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I can't believe in what those people say because they're Marxist. And that's a different conversation for a different day. But the truth is, Jesus didn't speak to Marxism because it wasn't fully invented until like 1900 years after he spoke. So I remember growing up, Clint, a lot of people are like, well, you got to watch out for Martin Luther King because he was kind of a socialist. And I was robbed for decades of King's prophetic voice and access to it because a lot of people are like, well, I'm not sure that he votes the way that we do. And that in hindsight, it was just nonsense. And again, I don't think that anybody who told us that, the generation that came before us, was trying to be mean. They were trying to defend the gospel, when in reality, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was giving us a vision of the gospel that was a lot broader than the ones that you and I had access to in the late 70s and early 80s.
Come on, preach it. Man, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, I was just talking about this the other day, is where Jesus brings the two groups of people together and says, I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was naked and you didn't give me clothes. I was in prison. You didn't visit me and depart from me. And it's like, the people are like, wait, where were you? I didn't see you. Right.
Right.
And then the next group is, you clothed me, you fed me. And they're even like, wait, where were you? It's like, I'm right with the least of these. And so, yeah, it is ironic, and maybe we're going down a different road, but it is ironic that the person that is always scared of too much social gospel is doing very little with social justice. Right. And so I think it's just crazy.
Yeah. And I think that Ephesians 2 is just a huge passage for me. It says that Jesus himself is our peace. Like, it's in Jesus we have peace, and through Jesus we have peace. And because we're not only are we reconciled to God through the person of Jesus, but we're reconciled to one another through the person of Jesus. And some people just stop and say like, well, if Clint and Steve didn't like each other, and then they found Jesus, then they did like each other. Like, yay, Jesus helps people who are enemies be friends on an individual level. That's not what Paul is saying in the passage. He's like, no, Jesus is bringing whole tribes together. And he was talking about Jews and Gentiles. And a Gentile is anybody who's not a Jew. You and I are Gentiles, and the Gazans are Gentiles, and the Arabs are Gentiles, and the French are Gentile. Well, the French non-Jews are Gentiles, right? So to be able to say Jesus exists to bring whole tribes. Jesus exists to upset every broken system. And I think that a lot of us grew up saying like, well, Jesus speaks to individuals. Of course he does, but we read the gospel that way because we live in an individualistic society. But people who have been living on the other side of broken systems, they're begging God to change systems.
Right.
Civilians who live in southern Israel are begging God to change a system where they have rockets rain down on their houses and their property and their farms. And fathers in Gaza are begging God to change a system that allows them to go to sleep at night as a family, not knowing if they're all going to wake up alive together. And for us to be able to say the gospel of Jesus is good news. And one of the things I learned over the region is if it's not good news for everybody, it's not good news. And so for us to be able to say, hey, we have inadvertently ingested a version of the gospel and a truncated version of the message of Jesus that says like, hey, if it's good for upper middle class, white, straight guys, then that's good news. And Jesus is saying like, you're reading it all wrong. It's good news for everybody. It's good news even for the people who don't want to believe it because they don't understand how it's good news for them yet. But it's our privilege to help clarify that. But it starts with repenting, and it starts with acknowledging that we've had a ton of misses along the way, and we're ready to humble ourselves at the feet of people whose stories are different than ours.
That's great. All right, I want to end with this. What should we be? Where should we be looking, reading? Because there's I've been reading a lot of articles where people are sharing social media of things that are not factual whatsoever on either side.
Yep.
And so I just think we got to be careful in this day and age to really know what we're sharing and know what we're doing. How do we, what are some of those best sources? And I kind of know some of the answer to this, but I think you did your doctoral thesis, right, on this whole conflict. So you might know more than me. That's all I'm saying.
I know bits and pieces, but Clint, here's the thing. Like we're living in an age of information overload, and I don't know about you, but the more time I spend on social media, and the irony is that we're making this available on social media, but the more time I spend on social media, the more time I spend like scrolling, the deader my soul gets because I'm overwhelmed by the information, or I'm led to fear, or I'm led to anger, or I'm led to throw up my hands and say like, well, this is really screwed up. It's always been screwed up. It'll never not be screwed up. And Clint, if we spend 3 hours a day exposing ourselves to media, and we spend 5 minutes a day exposing ourselves to the wisdom and the truth of Jesus, there should be no surprise that our media is doing a better job of forming us spiritually than the truth of Jesus is. And so what I want to do is just get to a spot where I say, you know what, maybe I'll watch 20 minutes of TV a day, or maybe I'll read 20 minutes of online news a day. But like, what would it look like if I actually capped my intake of information and then said, all right, Jesus, what do you need me to know about what's going on in the world? And what does obedience and surrender and faithful witness look like in light of what I have, in light of what I've been exposed to? Because here's what breaks my heart, Clint. We spend infinitely more time as a church, as a white evangelical church, spend infinitely more time complaining about what's going on in the world than we do interceding for this broken world, or lifting up hope in the midst of this broken world. And I think that we've really surrendered our sense of agency, and many of us have settled into a role of just kind of spectators rather than participants in what God wants to do in and for the world. And I'm done saying like, well, it's screwed up, and maybe when Jesus comes back, it'll get better. So I'm just going to keep doing what I was doing until that happens, and say, no, Lord, you have called me to be an agent of reconciliation, an
Mm.
agent of peace, an agent of restoration. What can that look like today? And if all it looks like today is prayer, then great. If what it looks like is reading a book, then great. And if you need it, if anybody who's listening or watching needs a recommendation on a book to start their journey with, based on where you want to, what part of the pool you want to jump into, I have more resources than you can tolerate to recommend for you.
Hey, maybe we can get those from you, and we'll post it.
Sure.
We'll post it on there so people can look some of those up. Yeah.
Yeah, a short book that's super accessible. I'm hoping that you can still get a hold of it. Is by a friend of mine named Dale Hansen-Burke. It's called A Skeptic's Guide to Israel-Palestine. It's got maps, it's got pictures. It's like 120 pages long, which is a good length for me. And it's just when we would travel to the region with teams, that was kind of the required reading that we gave people, because it just gave them good broad strokes. And then there's a bibliography in there, and you can kind of work your way forward from that.
Did you really want to say it's wasn't good for you, but good for me because it was a picture book? I love picture books.
I didn't say that, Clint.
I love picture books. Steve, I am so glad that you took this time to do this. I want to do this again. Sure. But I think, I'm so thankful that God crossed our paths, man. And you've, inspired Michael and I and our family. You've talked us off the cliff many times. Just by the wisdom that God has given you and the heart that God has given you. And we're thankful for you and your family. And I'm thankful for, I know this sounds a little dramatic, but just that people like you are here and are available. And the mind that God has given you is absolutely incredible. And this world is a better place. And I'm excited. It gives me hope. It really does. With things that you were talking about, relationships that you have, insight that you have, it gives me hope. And I think that's the only thing. We start with empathy, but we have to end with hope. And so I think what you're doing is absolutely incredible.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Clint.
All right, brother, I'm going to end this, but we'll get back on.
All right. Sounds like a plan.